This is DW News. I'm Phil Gale. Welcome to Ask DW, the show where your questions take centre stage. Today, we're taking your questions and comments regarding the situation in Ukraine and DW's coverage. It's easy to get in touch. Just go to youtube.com/DW News. You'll see the show there, live Q&A, the war in Ukraine. Click on that and you can put your questions and comments in the chat. Now, today's guest is DW correspondent Nick Connolly. You'll recognise Nick from his reporting from Ukraine, sometimes from the capital Kyiv, often from the front line. Welcome, Nick. Let's start with the surprise visit by the German foreign minister to Kyiv, her fourth trip since this war started. Annalena Baerbock travelled there by train overnight from Poland, unannounced, of course, for security reasons. The trip, supposedly a show of German support for the Ukrainian counteroffensive against the Russian occupation. Germany, of course, being one of Kyiv's biggest financial backers after the US. So what sort of signal is the German foreign minister trying to send?
I think this was about carrots and sticks. On the one hand, she was promising more money, more humanitarian aid. I think behind closed doors, there was obviously talk about those Taurus German long-range cruise missiles. That's something Ukraine desperately wants from the German side. But there was also criticism of failure to really make progress on reforms in terms of corruption that has been proven and also been the subject of a lot of kind of controversy within the country, and she was pretty direct in her criticism there. But there's a real sense that Ukraine is kind of part of the European family, that there is the expectation that it will join the EU sooner rather than later. So it was a kind of different quality of criticism. It was kind of accepting the fact that this is a country that will soon need to be ready to be a member of the EU. OK. Thanks for that, Nick. Nick Connolly, our guest for the next half hour or so. We are off and running. This is Ask DW. Our Ukraine reporter is here to take your comments and questions on the war in Ukraine. Go to youtube.com/DW News. Click on the live Q&A, the war in Ukraine, and just pop your comments into the chat box. And while you're doing that, and to give you an idea of the depth and breadth of Nick's reporting from Ukraine, we've put together a selection of highlights from some of his most impactful pieces. They not only capture the essence of the war, but also the spirit and resilience of the Ukrainian people.
As spring turns wet snow to mud, keeping upright is even harder than it looks. This forest might seem empty, but it's actually full of soldiers, all on the lookout.
We've got to keep our voices down because near here, the Russians are just a matter of a few hundred metres away.
Ivan and his friend are in a forward position. Without leaves on the trees, it feels exposed.
This is the village of Neskuchne, or what's left of it. One of a handful of places Ukrainian forces have retaken in recent weeks. Life is so dangerous here, it's one of the few places no one's coming back to. Being out in the open, visible to drones, is risky. The military van won't start. But then we're on our way. These men are fighting a painstaking battle, one village at a time. Their lives are already quite literally on the line.
It's time to move.
It's pretty overcast. It doesn't stop Russian drones from seeing us, but it makes it a bit more difficult and gives us a bit more time to talk to people in these positions that in theory are obviously a target for Russian strikes.
This Soviet-era Grad rocket artillery system is far from cutting-edge technology. But with a range of 40 kilometers, it can fire over the heads of the Ukrainian infantry in the trenches ahead and hold off Russian attacks. That makes these units a prime target for the Russian army. This is Vadim's 7th Grad of this war.
My last Grad was like a piece of Swiss cheese at the end. Loads of holes from shrapnel. Kept on going till the chassis conked out.
And yet the Grads are less of a problem than the lack of ammunition. Ukraine has used up decades' worth of stocks in a year. Kyiv and its allies are now scouring Europe and beyond for more.
Just the other week, we used up all our ammunition. We had nothing. We couldn't do anything for 4 days.
This armoured personnel carrier is normally used to bring out the wounded. It knocks its passengers around so much that soldiers joke many of the wounded pick up new injuries on their way to safety.
We're here 24/7, waiting for call-outs. We're basically an ambulance service, just that we run the risk of being killed doing our job. We had 2 casualties and more than a dozen wounded near us just yesterday. Everyone's nerves are shattered. Everyone you've met here so far, we're all civilians. We've all been called up. At most, a fifth are professional soldiers. That's outgoing. We're good.
You're watching Ask DW today, taking your questions on the war in Ukraine with DW correspondent Nick Connolly. First question in then. When will the US take serious steps to prepare for peace talks? That's from Truth Seeker Nick. What do you think?
I think all along the US side has talked about the fact that they are trying to help Ukraine get to a position where peace talks could happen at a level that is in some way favourable for Ukraine. I think they've never kind of closed off the possibility of talks, but they have pointed to various steps the Russians have taken, including now these pseudo-elections in occupied Ukraine. Russia seemingly trying to dig in and no kind of indication that Russia is anyway going to respect Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. I think it's important, this kind of semblance of being open to negotiation. That's why we had, for instance, those African presidents coming both to Kiev and to Russia. No one wants to be seen to be closed to these talks, but right now, realistically, there just isn't on either side a sense that either Ukraine or Russia is going to lose, and as such would need to make kind of painful compromises.
It's interesting, is implicit in the question is the idea that the United States is driving this one way or another, that they are the main people to be taken into consideration.
Well, that's certainly also a kind of line that the Russians are pushing, that basically Kiev is a puppet and that everything is decided in Washington. It has to be said, though, without US and European support, obviously Ukraine would be in a much more difficult position in terms of just finding the shells to keep on firing. But I think there isn't any willingness in Ukraine to countenance any kind of Russian-style deal. When you look at the sociology and even kind of in private conversation, even people who aren't particularly maybe fans of their government or particularly keen on the military pre this war, you really don't get a sense that people believe that this would achieve anything, because what they say is, we give in to the Russians now, we let them bite off another piece of territory, and then in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, the whole thing will continue. So there's no sense that this would actually achieve anything, that anything short of kicking the Russians out of all the Ukraine's territory would put an end to this.
OK. YouTube.com/DW News is how to get in touch with us. Let's have a look at the next question for our Ukraine correspondent, Nick Connolly. What is the status of the Kerch Bridge? Is it open again? That's from Martha Knox-Haley.
The kind of big picture is, yes, it is...
Well, remind us of where the Kerch Bridge is and why it's significant.
So this is the bridge connecting Ukrainian Crimea. It's been occupied by Russia since 2014 with the Russian mainland. This was a kind of pet project of Vladimir Putin's. Huge amount of money spent on it, kind of opened with big fanfare, with Putin driving across the bridge. And it's crucial not only psychologically as a symbol of kind of Russia's control of Crimea, but also for the logistics of bringing in weapons to Russian soldiers fighting in southern Ukraine. Without that bridge, basically it's going to be a whole lot more difficult for Russia to supply their garrisons. We saw last year when they left Kherson that basically they left because they couldn't get in the shells, they couldn't get in the supplies to keep on fighting. So this is crucial. And we've had lots of Ukrainian attempts to attack that bridge. There was a truck bomb, there have been sea drones, and routinely we see more drones heading that way and the bridge being closed for short periods of time. It is operational, albeit in a kind of reduced manner. That damage that was done by some of the drones has meant that the capacity has been reduced, but it is still functioning and it is still basically Ukraine's #1 target.
OK. Nick Connolly is our guest on youtube.com/DW News. Click on the feed there and put your comments or your questions in the comment box. Let's take a next question. Will the Ukrainian forces' ability to progress completely stop by the coming weather change, or do the tactics and weapons change?
Well, there's always been talk of the kind of fighting season being basically till the end of September, maybe mid-October, before the kind of colder weather, the rain comes in and the mud basically makes it impossible for heavy military kit to make progress. Having said that, last year we saw the Ukrainians retake Kherson early November even, so still 2 months to go. It's pretty unseasonably warm autumn across Europe right now, so we can't really kind of give any clear prognosis there. But I think there is a sense that the Ukrainians aren't going to give up. They aren't going to say, OK, we're going to call it a day now for the next 6 months, say, and give the Russians a new chance to dig in, to put more minefields in, to dig in and to protect those positions that they've built up since last year. And I think that the kind of interesting thing, just taking a kind of look at what was happening last year, there was exactly the same criticism of Ukraine's slow progress last year. This thing is kind of cumulative. You don't see much progress for a long time until basically the logistics become so difficult the Russians then collapsed and had to leave. You didn't see kind of, a village a week being taken. Basically nothing much happened for months at a time, and then suddenly the Russians basically overnight had to retreat over pretty large areas. So I think the same thing could still happen. At least that's the hope in Kiev.
Because there's been a lot of talk of this idea that Russia doesn't have to win this war. It just has to not get kicked out and be there long enough for Ukraine's Western backers to get bored or fed up, or indeed for there to be a change at the top in the United States.
I mean, that's certainly a fear in Kiev that a new US administration might be less willing to invest money and kind of diplomatic capital in all of this. I think the Europeans are now stepping up. Previously, the kind of first year of this war, European help basically paled next to what the US was providing. That has now caught up. Even in the military sphere, we've seen France and the UK providing cruise missiles that the US hasn't, for instance. Germany's still waiting for the US to take that step before it joins. So there is a sense that European support that's independent of the administration in Washington is becoming more important and could fill some of the gap. But obviously this is a fear. I think it's also not to be underestimated the price of this for Russia. We've seen, huge numbers of casualties now on the Russian side, real fear in Russia of mobilizing people in the big European kind of capital cities of Russia, in Petersburg and Moscow. They've so far basically tried to take people from the kind of rural areas who don't have the kind of ability to cause a fuss if then relatives are wounded or worse, killed. I think this is causing pretty huge stress financially and also politically for the Kremlin.
OK. Let's take our next question. YouTube.com/DW News, as we talk to our Ukraine correspondent, Nick Connolly. Under what circumstances could Ukraine press past the current front lines? Is the West helping as much as it can in this respect without risking a nuclear incident? That from Alex KH.
I think the nuclear threat has been something the Russians have tried to use since the beginning, and as we understand, the Chinese have been pretty clear in their communications with Moscow that they do not see this as an acceptable development. Basically, those threats have been called out and aren't very credible unless we see maybe attacks on Russia's internationally recognized territory. So I think that doesn't really work anymore. I mean, there has been speculation that people like Elon Musk were impressed by those threats, that he was talking direct to Vladimir Putin, and that maybe he limited Ukraine's access to the Starlink mobile internet because he was scared of some kind of big conflagration there. But I think, right now, the Western tactic of kind of trying to contain this as a kind of Ukrainian-Russian conflict rather than a bigger NATO-Russia conflict is working. We're seeing that the equipment heading to Ukraine is always provided with the proviso that it's only used against bits of occupied Ukrainian territory, not against Russia proper. Ukraine having to use its own drones, its own kind of know-how, its own kit to attack Moscow, to attack other targets in Russia. And I think for now, there's no real sense that this is kind of more dangerous than it was in terms of a kind of escalation. Right,
but also no real sense of Ukraine pushing significantly past Russian lines.
It has. I mean, it has pushed through some minefields. I mean, this is obviously a very slow, painstaking effort. And if in a democratic country like Ukraine, you can't just basically send thousands of people to their deaths as the Russians did in Bakhmut, you're obviously going to have to do this more slowly and more carefully, and it's going to take some time. But we have seen some of those first Russian defence lines being broken, and there's a real hope in Ukraine now that they will be able basically to kind of create chaos behind the Russian lines by attacking Russian positions from what the Russians thought was their kind of hinterland, more equipment being provided, more cruise missiles that will allow Ukraine to destroy bridges, not just the Kerch Bridge, but also other logistics hubs, fuel depots. So there is a hope that this might, still pull off something. But I think the idea that somehow one counteroffensive and the whole thing is over, I think that was only ever something that was believed in maybe kind of Western media when politicians were trying to kind of get their domestic public to kind of relax and think, OK, this isn't going to be a 5-year conflict, just a bit more and it'll be over. I don't think anyone in Kiev seriously thought that this was going to be over by the end of this year. OK, thanks for that, Nick. Nick Connolly is our guest, our Ukraine reporter, taking your questions. YouTube.com/DW News. Let's take our next question, Nick. Any moment now.
OK, this sort of speed, I could walk to the YouTube servers, write it down and bring it back to you. OK, while we're waiting for that... Oh, no, there it is. Do you foresee Ukrainian elections taking place next year, Nick? If yes, who's likely to compete with Zelensky? That's an interesting question. When is next year when Ukrainian elections are scheduled?
Yeah, so that's the case. But so far, no one really has kind of believed that this is actually going to be on the cards for many reasons, right? You've got lots of people who are refugees in Europe. You've got lots of people who are displaced inside the country. So, trying to work out the kind of electoral roles, who should vote where, it's going to be a nightmare. You've got 1 million people fighting, how are they going to take part, how are they going to vote. It also costs a lot of money. Zelensky spoke of about $5 billion being the price tag of conducting national elections. And also there's the kind of political point about restoking those kind of internal political divisions that have been basically covered over, and basically there's been a kind of unspoken consensus in Ukraine that even people who don't support Zelensky are going to basically keep out of kind of aggressive day-to-day politics and try and work together to keep the war effort going. So there's lots of reasons why not. We have heard from US policymakers, US politicians who are visiting Kiev. They said, democracy comes before everything else. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's cumbersome, but you've got to do this. I don't know quite how much traction that has in Washington right now. There's also speculation that maybe Zelensky would want to kind of capitalize on his leader of the nation, kind of wartime commander-in-chief role right now, before people really count the price and kind of count the cost of this war as soon as the fighting has ended. But I can't really see it happening for now. But Ukraine is a place where you're constantly surprised, so maybe it will happen after all.
But no official announcement as yet?
Lots of question marks and no real kind of confirmation either way.
OK, interesting question. Thank you for that. Let's take the next question then. Here it is. Was it a mistake for Ukraine to use Starlink for battlefield communications in the light of Musk's revelations? That's from TFH. So, of course, Elon Musk, as you were saying there, the man providing Ukraine with its internet communications satellite, was that a mistake?
I think they didn't have any other option. So it wasn't like they had a choice. But obviously, this is a kind of unique situation where you've got a private individual who has such huge ability to influence the capabilities of the Ukrainian army. So he was accused or claimed by his biographer to have deactivated Starlink in Crimea to prevent a Ukrainian attack on the Russian fleet there because he was supposedly scared of Russian escalation. He has said that's not the case. He said it wasn't activated, he just didn't meet a Ukrainian request to activate, so he didn't give something additional rather than deactivate something that already existed. But certainly I think there's basically no other civilian who has that much leverage over Ukraine right now. And it is extraordinary even that the US government doesn't really seemingly want to challenge him in public. The fact that he supposedly had these one-to-one talks with Vladimir Putin, I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. You can't imagine anyone else doing that and getting away with it.
OK. Nick Connolly, our Ukraine reporter, is our guest. Taking your questions, we'll go straight to the next one. Here it is. See, I said that more in hope than expectation. Here it is. How strong are the ideological convictions of the Russian army? Are they cynically collecting a check? Are they true believers? Are they interested in politics? This is an interesting story about how much of the picture the Russian people and the Russian soldiers are actually getting.
I think, first off, it's important to say that we don't have access to the Russian trenches, the Russian frontline positions, because they don't let most Western media in. Deutsche Welle was kicked out of Russia. So we only can go on what we see in social media. We see lots of people, especially volunteers on the Russian side, who are kind of patriotic critics often, or what they would consider patriotic critics of Putin's going and saying, we need to fight more, we need to take all of Ukraine. So it is limited, but there does seem to be lots of different motivations. There are people who want to restore Soviet kind of sphere of influence, and they don't believe Ukraine is a legitimate independent country. There are certainly people who are in it for the money. The wages being offered, especially at the beginning of the war, especially to the Wagner group, were just unbelievable for small Russian provincial areas. They were being offered salaries that were 3, 4, 5, 6 times more than anything they could ever hope to earn at home. So certainly there were people who were going for that reason, and initially at least there were also huge payouts when people lost their lives. Families were paying off their mortgages, getting cars. These were very significant sums of money, and I think that is something that is relevant in lots of parts of Russia. OK, thanks for that, Nick. Let's go straight to the next question. Here it is. How many Russian soldiers have surrendered, who have surrendered and are still in captivity? Do we know? The Ukrainians don't really give clear figures about this or about casualty figures from their own side, so this is all very difficult to quantify. Obviously, the Russians have no interest in kind of being clear about this to their own public, and obviously there are huge ethical issues connected to reporting and filming and interviewing people who are in captivity. That's why we don't do it. I think there is a sense that the exchanges have been more frequent and more rapid than anyone expected. So when I got to Ukraine in 2017, people would languish in captivity for a year, 2 or longer. And now it seems like most people do only spend a couple of months before being exchanged. So there is a kind of hope that they will be exchanged back.
So this is a regular process?
It is, surprisingly, for all the kind of ferocity of the fighting and the kind of huge loss of life, these exchanges continue. Even we saw the Azov commanders, this Ukrainian regiment particularly hated by the Kremlin and its news outlets, and even they got out within a matter of months rather than years. So that's pretty striking.
OK. Straight to the next question then, as we talk to DW's Nick Connolly about the war in Ukraine. Nick, is Turkey the key to a geopolitical compromise in the grain deal?
I think it certainly was. I mean, I think the grain deal as it existed for the first year of the war was basically thanks to Turkey, thanks to Erdogan's mediation. But I think the Russians have decided that they're not getting enough out of it and that they can basically get away with stopping, reneging on this deal, pulling out. We had very interesting interaction when you had those African presidents visiting Russia and Vladimir Putin saying, well, OK, I'm not interested in the grain deal. The Ukrainian grain is going to be stuck, but I'll gift you some smaller volumes of grain. And you had some of his guests saying, we don't want gifts, we don't want handouts, we want to buy grain at a normal international price. You've got to let the Ukrainian grain out. Putin obviously just ignoring that. But kind of extraordinary, it does feel like the fact that basically all of Ukraine has been blockaded now, not just the agriculture exports, but also the metals, anything else has been basically closed off while Russia ships oil, its own grain, its own fertilizers, and actually has been profiting from rising grain prices because of that Ukrainian competition being blocked off. Somehow the kind of international community has kind of accepted that and don't really call Russia out on that.
Because there's a double advantage. Not only is Ukraine not making money from exporting grain or whatever, but that sends the price up and Russia is happy to export.
And not only that, there's also been examples of Russia stealing grain from occupied Ukraine and selling it as its own grain from its own ports.
Nick Connolly is our guest today at youtube.com/DW News. Click on the show there, Q&A, the war in Ukraine, and your comments and questions go in the comments box. Nick, do you think the UN peacekeeping forces are an option for the future in Ukraine? That's from Johan Skanebi.
Well, there was talk of peacekeepers before 2022, kind of Donbass conflict that had been rumbling on since 2014 to try and basically kind of because there were still people losing their lives on a kind of weekly basis then. So there was talk then of trying to kind of fix the line with peacekeepers, and they could never agree on the terms. They couldn't agree on which countries would take part and how they would be supplied with weapons. Would they be able to shoot, or would they just be there to observe? I think realistically right now this is just too hot a conflict with two armies that are just too high-tech and too well-resourced for anyone really to be willing to send in their peacekeepers, with a helmet and maybe a gun and a rifle. I think it's just too early for that kind of step.
Especially with members of the Permanent Security Council on opposing sides.
Exactly. So I think that is something that people have hoped would be an option, but I think it's unfortunately just too early for that. And right now it is a too dangerous situation.
On to our next question then, to Nick Connolly. Here it is. We don't hear much about the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant now. What's the situation there? That's from Tom Eric Gunderson.
Still very grim. You've got Europe's biggest nuclear power station with multiple reactors within a few dozen kilometres of the front line. It's constantly losing power because the power lines coming in, which are needed to basically cool the fuel, they're constantly being interrupted, being destroyed, and there's a kind of mad rush while the generators are still up and running and there's still enough diesel to cool this nuclear fuel to then bring in new connections, restore the connections so that basically this can be kept safe. And again, everyone's got used to it. There are inspections, international inspections, but basically Russia demands a lot of advance warning. So basically they can, if the Ukrainians make an allegation, basically they can move everything around by the time the inspectors get there. And then, surprise, surprise, the inspectors come in and say, oh, well, we haven't found anything too egregious there. So it's not really a very effective inspections regime. And I went to a town that's just opposite the power station on the other side of the Dnieper River that basically can't defend itself. It's constantly being attacked by Russian units near the power station, and they can't fire back for fear of attacking their own power station. So it is a very dangerous situation, and one that, again, everyone seemingly has kind of just got used to.
Our next question, then, as we talk to Ukraine correspondent Nick Connolly. How will Ukraine pay back all this military debt, especially with very few working-age citizens?
I think that's something no one is really talking about right now. I think that is something that is just kind of postponed in everyone's minds till this is over, to kind of trying to assess the costs in terms of lives, in terms of financial damage, in terms of debt for the government. That is just kind of so far beyond people's day-to-day kind of existence. But certainly there is hope in Ukraine that Russian assets that have been frozen will eventually be will be basically confiscated and handed over to the Ukrainian side. There are very significant legal problems about that. There's a real fear in the West that that could erode confidence in the Western banking system. But certainly there is a hope that Russian assets will go towards paying what is, huge cost to Ukraine and its government.
And this is debt accrued how? Because, of course, the weapons and all the rest of it, that's gifted.
Mixed. Some is gifted, some is for money, but in return for loans that are kind of very long term and maybe at pretty low interest rates. So there's a mix. Most of it is a gift, but also Ukraine is having to go to the world markets and find any shells, any bullets it can. So basically it's a kind of mad scramble, a bit like at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And, any supplier they can find on eBay, as it were, is basically good enough. And often there's talk of substandard quality stuff being promised and not delivered because there hasn't been a conflict on this scale for decades. So this stuff is either in storage or it's just being produced at speed.
All right, let's take our next question. Nick Connolly is our guest, taking your questions about Ukraine. Have Russian tactics changed from the initial approach of sending waves of poorly trained soldiers to identify Ukrainian positions? That's from Patrick Richard.
Well, certainly, you probably remember those images from the first few weeks of the war with that huge column of Russian armoured vehicles trying to get to Kiev, just one long kind of road leading through some pretty empty agricultural areas, dozens of kilometres long, being picked off by the Ukrainians bit by bit. I think they've learnt their lesson. I think they underestimated the Ukrainians. They thought they would be in Kiev in 3 days, as they said. So they are a lot more cautious. They're using more drones. At the beginning, the Ukrainians had an advantage. They were using more drones and the Russians were behind. But they are still less flexible than the Ukrainians. It is a very hierarchical system. Commanders on the ground have a lot less leeway than the Ukrainians do to react to things happening. And extraordinarily, they still apparently have very, very bad walkie-talkies, radio systems. So the Ukrainians are listening in to a lot of what they're saying.
OK, thank you so much for that, Nick. Thanks for sharing your insights and for being our first guest on this first edition of Ask DW. Thanks a lot.